Bienvenue sur BetaSeries la radio pour un épisode d'Originals, l'émission dédiée aux séries qui font l'actu. Aujourd'hui, coup de projecteur sur la saison 2 de Godfather of Harlem, une série originale StarzPlay diffusée cet été en France. Godfather of Harlem réimagine l'histoire de la vie de Bumpy Johnson, gangster noir américain des années 60. Après avoir passé 11 ans dans la prison d'Alcatraz, il revient à Harlem dans le but de reprendre le contrôle de son quartier. Le personnage principal est campé par un Forest Whitaker au sommet de son art, accompagné d'un casting de choix, Vincent D'Onofrio, vu dans Daredevil, Giancarlo Esposito, vu dans Breaking Bad, et Nigel Thatch, vu dans Selma. Les querelles entre les organisations criminelles et la mafia italienne s'entremêlent avec la montée du mouvement pour les droits civiques des Noirs américains mené par Malcolm X. Nous avons aujourd'hui la joie d'interviewer Chris Brancato, producteur exécutif de la série, pour vous présenter cette saison 2. Hi Chris, thank you very much for being with us today. So the first season of Godfather of Harlem has had a tremendous success thanks to smart storytelling, great cast and active performances, strong visual identity and great soundtrack. It won a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Main Title Design. So first, congratulations and thank you for this great show. Before Godfather of Harlem and amongst other great shows, you were the co-creator of Narcos. You seem to have an interest, if not a slight obsession, in mob stories. Why is that?
I'm not quite sure. I certainly, the dark side of human existence interests me. I think part of it is the idea of watching people who do things that society, that society looks down upon. I'm interested in what leads to criminality. I'm interested, as many of us are, in the boldness that criminals exhibit when they break the law. And I'm also interested in seeing them brought to justice or in one form or another. And that informs both the story of Pablo Escobar in Narcos, but also the story of Bumpy Johnson in Godfather of Harlem.
So how did this show come to life? I've read somewhere that it was Forest Whitaker who approached you with the idea of creating the show. Is that right?
A couple of producers came to my friend Paul Eckstein and I, who created the show, with an interest in doing a television series about Bumpy Johnson in the 1960s. The reason they came to us is that Paul and I had produced a movie in the 90s called Hoodlum, where Lawrence Fishburne played Bumpy Johnson in the 1930s. So Paul and I were familiar with the character of Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson had put Paul's grandmother through secretarial school. So Bumpy was a character who in Harlem had done a lot of good for people. And my friend Paul, who was Black, was always saying to me, there should be a movie about this guy. He's really interesting. And so I wrote and we co-produced a movie with Fishburne playing Bumpy Johnson set in the 1930s. So when Forrest and his producers, Marquand Smith and Jim Atchison, came to us with the idea of doing Bumpy Johnson in the 60s, my first reaction was, well, I've done the character already. What much more is there to say? And when I realized that Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X were very, very close friends, they played chess on Sundays, they met for breakfast in the local restaurant, it suddenly occurred there may be a new angle on Bumpy Johnson that I hadn't considered in the earlier film version, that the collision of the criminal underworld and the civil rights movement might be a way to do a gangster show with a new angle on it that made it feel fresh and different. I'm always looking for ways to put the typical tropes of the gangster genre on their ear, because we've all seen so many types of gangster shows. They're on some level, the progression of a criminal gangster is the same, no matter whether you're in France, New York, Russia. You know, it's basically be willing to kill, to rise up the business ladder. And to that end, a lot of times crime is relegated to second-class citizen communities who aren't able to get an education, who aren't able to climb the traditional ladders of success. So we were interested in exploring crime as a means of economic advancement rather than crime as an indication of lack of morality. Now, crime does indicate a lack of morality, but it also indicates a desire for economic success that may be very difficult to achieve in the particular society one is in. So certainly Bumpy Johnson, who wanted to be a lawyer but was rejected from the City College of New York because he was Black, was someone who felt no other avenue to turn to other than crime in his teen years and in his formative years. And so now in the 60s, we see Bumpy Johnson as an elder statesman, and the idea that his view of the world would be touched by Malcolm X, by a sudden and ground swelling realization on the part of America that the foundations of the country are built upon slavery, and that there is justice to be had. What's interesting on our shows, we like to call it the education of Bumpy Johnson, because he's a very self-interested man. He's a man who has a lot to learn. The method by which he achieves economic success and philanthropy and all of his good works is actually built on the back of a crime that destroys his community, the importation of heroin from Marseille. And so what we wanted to do is watch a gangster who has some very rational reasons for having become a criminal slowly but surely get challenged in his worldview by his friendship with a radical preacher who doesn't believe Bumpy should be dealing in drugs at all. But that's a process that's going to hopefully take many seasons.
In the first season, you show how, well, maybe more in the first movie, but there's things in the first season that show us that the fact that he chose crime as a career was by default because he could not get a normal career, the one he chose. And then he built himself over crime related to drugs. And then by being a friend of Malcolm X, and I think at some point Malcolm X says something along the line of a criminal being politicalized is the most powerful thing we can have. So I think that's kind of where you're taking us slowly but surely with the second season. So the character of Bumpy Johnson is really central to the show. Malcolm X says about him in the show, I often thought of Bumpy as a stone with many facets. So he can be violent and tough, even cruel, but he's also shown to be very vulnerable, sensitive. There are moments where you can tell he's so tragically sad. Like, how do you think this character is going to evolve in the second season, and what new challenges is he going to have to face?
Well, that's a very good question. First of all, Bumpy Johnson, there's very little written about him. He's mentioned in certain people's biographies, but there wasn't an extensive amount of research to do other than one or two books and chapters in books, and also speaking to some people who knew him directly, who are still alive. So for Forrest Whitaker and myself, the challenge here was, how do you create a characterization out of a man where there is very little written? Whereas on the other hand, Malcolm X wrote an entire autobiography, and Malcolm's attitudes about things are very, very well covered in the research. So Forrest and I worked hard to talk about how we express these different aspects of character, and perhaps what we came to was this facets of a diamond approach, which is, well, if he's a philanthropist, let's show examples of that in action. If he's a ruthless killer, let's show examples of that. Let's put them up against one another and allow for the viewer to take away who they see as Bumpy Johnson. And one of the things we were a little bit worried about, because it's a television show designed to entertain and Bumpy is your lead character, if in the first season we see a Bumpy who may even tilt towards the super heroic. In other words, he ultimately chooses the path that sort of the viewer would like him to choose. He ends up on the side of what seems fair and good. And that's, I think, who Bumpy was. In the second season, we start to explore some of the rifts in the psychology of a gangster. We start to call some of those contradictions into question. For example, your own daughter is a heroin addict and look at the larger community that's been ravaged by the importation of drugs. In fact, you're trying to take over the French Connection from the Italians and flood Harlem with even more heroin. What does that mean for your soul? And what does it mean that in this country in 1964, we have the Mississippi Freedom Riders trying to get voting rights for African Americans and being killed? The voter suppression efforts, the marches, the protests, all of these things force Bumpy to reconsider his place in the world and his place as a Black man in America. And obviously, as we were working between seasons, what we had in our country was the murder of George Floyd. And so we felt we were making the show in the second season for a different America, an America that had once again been roiled by these divisive racial issues that have been brewing for years. And speaking for myself personally, I'm able to see many, many things about today's America and today's world that are improvements, at least in my opinion, from the way things were in the 1960s. We have, for instance, had a Black president. The economic opportunities have improved on some level. And on a completely other level, nothing has changed, or not much has changed. You still have the issues of police brutality. What type of protest is acceptable in our country? The continued ghettoification of the Black lower income class, the inability to find jobs, and the continued barriers of entry to attaining the American dream. And so I think what the show does is what it is able to do, because it's looking through this prism of the past, the show is able to examine these very hot button issues, these issues that make people very uncomfortable to discuss in the present. But when you set them in the remove of the past, you're able to actually make commentary about today in a safer way through this prism. And so we felt a great responsibility, Forrest, myself, the writers, Paul Eckstein, the producers, Marquand Smith and Jim Atchison and Nina Bonjovi. We all felt a great privilege to be able to do this show in the here and now, to make our commentary on the way we see things through these characters. And at the same time, we felt a great responsibility, because this is no longer just the stuff of a purely entertainment escapist show. This is about what's happening in the world and in America.
So what would you want people to retain from the show? And I'm thinking about maybe two angles. First, what do you want young generations to remember or to understand? And there's also in the show, it's maybe not the lead theme, but it's quite strong. There's the subtle and growing role of women in your show. So on those two lines, what do you want people to retain from your show? It's great entertainment, but it's very political as well.
Well, I think that the thing I'd like the most is for people to be entertained, for them to watch it and not get bored, for them to want to see the next episode after this one ends. But at the same time, what Paul and I in particular wanted people to do, particularly young people who aren't particularly familiar with Malcolm X, is look things up. Much of what our show talks about, many of the little events you see in the second season, the little fruit stand riot, in the first season, the March on Washington, where Powell and Malcolm X came together, those things are all based on real research. And so all you have to do is watch the show and perhaps jump on your Google, and now you can do a little more research, and you can see where we had to take dramatic liberties. And so the idea that the show potentially causes young viewers to further explore the era and the thoughts behind it, and in particular, the philosophies of Malcolm X, which are so resonant today. All of those things are important to us, as well as hopefully, understanding that the criminal path that Bumpy chose comes at a great cost. Anybody watching the show, our goal is not to glamorize the criminal lifestyle. And in fact, Bumpy Johnson himself was very clear about the fact that for him, this was business. It was business because normal, legitimate businesses, he had been precluded from entering normal businesses. So we're doing he always wears a business suit. He's not flossing, as they say. He's not wearing the shaggy coat and the hat with a feather. So there's that. In terms of the women, the women characters play a very central role in reality within the Black community, and even within the community, the criminal community. Women have a role that's very, very different than their Italian counterparts. In the Italian mafia world, women are completely kept out of it. They have no knowledge of what's going on. They're left willfully ignorant. In the Black community, it's not quite the same. The women are partners to some degree, are certainly aware of what's going on, and oftentimes counselors, helpers, and in some cases, fellow criminals. So what we wanted to do, we have this incredible, I must say something about our cast. From, you have Forrest Whitaker and Giancarlo and Vincent D'Onofrio and Chaz Palminteri and Paul Sorvino. You have the famous actors, but all of these other actors who are a little less well known, like Ilfanesh Hadera and Antoinette Crow Legacy.
I'm so very sorry, Chris. I think we're time-wise, we're way beyond. I really don't want to make you late for other interviews or anything. I'd stay here and talk about this with you all day. But I'm sorry, I'm afraid we're going to have to finish that interview.
Well, as you see, I can talk about it all day. So
yes, and I can listen to it all day, but it's going to be a problem. But anyway, thank you very much for this show. So I will encourage our audience to watch the season 2, and I hope I can talk to you maybe for a 3rd season some other time. Thank you very much for being with us, Chris.
Of course. Thank you, Mahalia. Thank you.